So, for the last 5 nights, the war everyone's been watching has been about a stretch of water called the Strait of Hormuz. This week, a second one just opened up, 600 miles south. On Monday, the runway at Sanaa International Airport, the capital of Yemen, went up in smoke. Within hours, missiles and drones were flying at a Saudi airport in return, and the group that fired them just declared, in their words, that the de-escalation phase of a war that's been mostly quiet for 4 years is over. Here's why an airport strike in Yemen might end up mattering more to your gas price than anything happening in the Gulf right now. Quick recap, if you're catching this one first. Since February 28th, the US and Israel have been at war with Iran. Iran's supreme leader was killed in the opening strikes. A naval blockade of Iranian ports went up, came down after a ceasefire in June, and went back up on July 13th when President Trump declared the truce over. That's the Gulf side of the story. Here's the part that just widened it. The Houthis, the Iran-aligned movement that's controlled Yemen's capital, Sanaa, since 2014, sent a delegation to Iran for Ali Khamenei's funeral earlier this month. On their way back, tensions escalated over which plane would carry them home. Yemen's internationally recognized government, the one backed militarily by Saudi Arabia, says it struck the runway at Sanaa Airport, specifically to stop an Iranian aircraft from landing there. The Houthis, who control that airport, characterize the strike differently, as an act by their Saudi-backed rivals, carried out at Riyadh's direction. Whichever framing you use, the outcome was the same: smoke over Sanaa's airport, caught on video by Houthi-run Al Masirah TV, and a runway that can't currently take a plane. The Houthis responded within hours. Missiles and drones aimed at Abha International Airport, inside Saudi Arabia. No casualties reported, but their military spokesman, Yahya Saree, said the group's 4 years of relative restraint toward Saudi Arabia, restraint that's held since a 2022 truce just ended. A Houthi political official went further, threatening what he called a siege on Saudi Arabia and naming a second target, King Khalid International Airport in Riyadh. Now let me explain why this isn't just a Yemen story. Hi, my name is David Whitmore. Hope you're doing well. Come for the airport strike. Stay for the second oil choke point nobody priced in yet. What officially happened, on the record, this is being treated as two separate stories that happen to be colliding at the same moment. Story 1, a flare-up in Yemen's own long-running civil war. A conflict between the Houthis and Yemen's internationally recognized Saudi-backed government that's been mostly frozen since a 2022 truce. That truce is the reason the UN Security Council has spent the last 2.5 years renewing a simple monthly reporting requirement on Houthi attacks on shipping, rather than debating a new crisis. That requirement was due for renewal this month. Story 2, the Houthis' separate role as one of Iran's regional partners, what Tehran calls the axis of resistance, which resumed firing at Israel back in March, once the wider war with Iran began. This week, those two stories became one, and the pivot point was a very specific detail: the Houthi delegation flying home from a funeral. What the fine print actually says. Here's what's easy to miss if you only catch the headlines. This didn't come out of nowhere. Go back to June 9th. Just 2 days after Iran struck US bases across the Gulf and declared Hormuz fully closed, the commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Quds Force, Brigadier General Esmail Qaani, made a specific threat that continued escalation would trigger a coordinated response from Iran's regional partners aimed at building what he called a security belt, stretching from the Strait of Hormuz all the way to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, 600 miles south. Bab el-Mandeb is the other choke point. Now the narrow gateway between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden that virtually all shipping between Europe and Asia has to pass through on the way to or from the Suez Canal. So when the Houthis say the de-escalation phase is over, that's not an isolated Yemeni civil war statement. It's the activation of a threat Iran's own military leadership previewed 5 weeks earlier, on the record, in public. What nobody is talking about. Now hold on, because there's a precedent here that explains exactly how much damage a group like the Houthis can do without a navy, an air force, or a single warship. Between late 2023 and mid-2024, the Houthis ran a sustained campaign against Red Sea shipping, in solidarity, they said, with Gaza. At its peak, that campaign cut Suez Canal traffic by more than half. Roughly 15% of global trade that normally moved through the Red Sea got rerouted around Africa, adding as much as 2 weeks and enormous fuel costs to shipments between Asia and Europe. Companies like Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd pulled out of the route entirely. It took a US-led naval campaign, Operation Rough Rider, Whitmore Blockade, Warasis Kandi, Wanisen, Waratichi, Wen, and hundreds of American strikes to bring that under control, and even then, attacks continued in some form until last year's Gaza ceasefire. That's the playbook, and right now, Saudi Arabia is quietly hedging against it. Reuters has reported the kingdom is considering expanding a pipeline that lets it bypass the Gulf entirely and load crude directly onto the Red Sea coast. That pipeline has been the thing keeping global oil prices from spiking even harder during the Hormuz blockade. If the Houthis make the Red Sea coast itself a target, that backup plan stops being a backup plan. What this reveals about the system, here's the part that connects everything back to the blockade video. This war has one master vulnerability for the West and the Gulf states. There are only 2 doors big tankers can use to move Middle Eastern oil to the rest of the world. Door 1 is the Strait of Hormuz, and that door's been closing and reopening for 5 months. Door 2 is Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea corridor behind it, which until this week had stayed open. Iran doesn't need its own navy to threaten both doors at once. It needs exactly what it has, a blockade of its own coastline that it can fight over directly, and a partner 600 miles away that can threaten the other exit without a single Iranian ship leaving port. That's not a coincidence, and it's not improvised. It's the security belt strategy Kwani described in June, now visibly in motion. And that is exactly why oil markets reacted the way they did. Benchmark crude jumped to around $85 a barrel this week, not purely on the Hormuz strikes, but on the compounding fear of a second front. The market isn't pricing in a Yemeni civil war. It's pricing in the possibility that both exits close at once. Now, I'm not saying Yemen's civil war and the Iran war are the same conflict. They're not. They have separate roots, separate combatants, a separate truce that predates any of this. But I am saying that this week, for the first time, they became strategically inseparable. And that was very likely the point. The human and political backdrop, the UN's special envoy to Yemen, Hans Grundberg, has already urged both sides to step back. A sign of how fragile the 2022 truce actually is, 4 years in. And there's a detail worth sitting with. What triggered all of this wasn't a battlefield decision. It was a funeral. The same funeral procession we covered last video, 6 days, 5 cities, tens of millions of mourners for Ali Khamenei, reached all the way into a decades-old, largely separate civil war 300 miles away because a delegation needed a plane home. That's how tightly wound this region's conflicts have become. A burial in Mashhad can reopen a front line in Sanaa within a week. So, who wins and who loses from a second choke point opening up? Saudi Arabia loses the most immediately. It's now been directly struck for the first time in years, its restraint for restraint arrangement with the Houthis broken, and a second of its airports named as a potential future target. Global shipping and insurance markets lose next. Every major carrier remembers 2023 and 2024, and rerouting around Africa is an expensive decision that gets made fast and unwound slowly. Iran's negotiating position, paradoxically, gets stronger, not because Tehran ordered this precisely, but because a second front makes the cost of continued US pressure on Hormuz higher for everyone, Washington, Riyadh, and global markets alike. Every choke point under threat is leverage Iran didn't have to spend a single one of its own ships to create. And the clear loser, again, is the same one from last video, anyone who buys fuel. 2 choke points under simultaneous strain is a different kind of risk than one. It's the difference insurers and traders price as elevated versus crisis. Zoom out, and here's the pattern this confirms. Modern pressure campaigns don't stay contained to their starting point. A blockade built to squeeze one country's ports can, within months, pull in a civil war 800 miles away that had nothing to do with the original conflict. Because the same narrow waterways that make blockades effective also make them contagious. The open question now is whether Saudi Arabia's restraint holds a second time, or whether siege turns from a Houthi threat into a Houthi campaign. Riyadh has spent 4 years avoiding exactly that fight. Yemen's civil war was supposed to be the quiet one, the front nobody expected to reopen. It just did, over an airport runway and a plane full of mourners. The Strait of Hormuz taught us what one closed door does to the price of oil. What happens when there are two? Drop your take in the comments. Does this pull Saudi Arabia deeper into the war it's tried hardest to stay out of? Or does the 2022 truce somehow hold? If this connected the dots the headlines left scattered, share it with someone tracking this story.